Donald Trump sounds like an extortionist. If allies want the protection of the USA, they have to pay. It is a blunt warning by the Republican presidential candidate and a taste of what's to come should he return to the presidency. Russia would be able to do whatever it wants with delinquent NATO members, a possibility that appalls and horrifies NATO partner states. Many EU countries see Trump's statements as a wake-up call to become militarily self-sufficient. Ukraine is also planning to challenge Russia with new military leadership and a new strategy. On To The Point, we ask Putin and Trump, a new axis against NATO and Ukraine. Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. And these are today's guests. Rachel Tausendfreund is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Moritz Gathmann is a reporter for Germany's Stern magazine, for which he recently reported from Ukraine. And Nico Lange is a political consultant and security expert and a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference. He's joining us from the city of Munich. To all of you, thank you for joining us today. And Rachel, I'd like to start with you because here we are talking about Donald Trump's remarks even before he's officially the Republican candidate, let alone a president or president of the United States. Why is that again?
Trump is magic. If there's one thing he knows how to do, it's to get everyone's attention, even when he says things that actually aren't surprising. We know that this is Trump's position on NATO. We know he's not a fan of NATO. He spent his first presidency complaining about the members who didn't pay up, in his way of saying. And yet, he is able to shock Americans and the world by saying, what he thinks in a particularly outrageous way.
And the world is certainly reacting. Nico, I'd like to get to you. In Munich, the Munich Security Conference gathers international leaders in Germany to talk about global security issues. Is Donald Trump one of them?
He's one of the leaders or one of the issues. I think that will be debated.
I would say one of the issues for the moment being. Yeah.
Certainly, I think this is a long campaign coming in the United States. We should ask ourselves the question, do we really want to deal with what Donald Trump says every day? At the same time, it is true that, especially at this Munich Security Conference, the question how the Europeans will continue to support Ukraine and what will the Europeans do for their own security to deter Russia, the questions will be on the table and they will be intensively discussed.
You already mentioned it, Nico, and Moritz, I'd like to ask you. Donald Trump's efforts to get to the White House this time around are different because of the context of the war in Ukraine. How do you think does that change the stakes of the U.S. election?
I think that it basically means for the Europeans that we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So I would say that until the end of last year, everybody was still hoping that maybe the Republicans will choose another candidate for the presidential elections. And, well, the financial help for Ukraine will somehow pass. But over the last weeks, we understood that neither the first thing nor the second happened. So we should prepare for the worst, which means no more financial or military aid from the US for Ukraine and a possible President Trump.
A possible President Trump that we don't know what he's going to do with NATO. Trump recently drew attention to himself with new statements in which he threatened to hand over delinquent NATO members to Putin if they failed to meet their budget.
It's the largest NATO maneuver of all time, Operation Steadfast Defender, a name that says it all. A 4-month-long military exercise to demonstrate the strength of the military alliance. Meanwhile, in the USA, presidential candidate Donald Trump reiterates his low opinion of NATO and vows to cut off protection for delinquent allies who don't pay their dues in full.
No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
Trump's provocations aren't anything new. Even when he was president, he repeatedly criticized the alliance. But this time, his comments are horrifying partners in the alliance. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg claimed Trump's words undermine our security. in Europe is worried. NATO's promise of protection applies without restriction, all for one for all. When it comes to the security of the Western world, nothing can replace American power. But for obvious reasons, we in Europe need to wake up. Is security in Europe even possible without the USA?
That's, of course, the big question. Some European leaders, as we saw, are extremely concerned. Moritz, is that justified? Do you think they should be fearing an empowered Russia?
Of course, it's justified because without the help of the US, if you look at the conflict or at the war in Ukraine, there are totally different perspectives. It's obvious that even if the European Union scales up its help for Ukraine, it can't replace the military aid from the US. That chunk is just too big. So the perspective of this war is totally different without funding from the US.
And what about the perspective for the European security as a whole?
Well, I think for the European security as a whole, that's the same thing. If Trump is not president at the moment, but basically him saying things like this already undermines at this point European security, because from the perspective of Russia, it means that Article 5 of NATO maybe is not that serious. In fact, it's not that serious as it seems.
Article 5 meaning that if one country has an aggression, all the other countries will defend it. Yeah. Rachel, as Moritz just said, Donald Trump is not president yet. We've been here before, haven't we? Fearing what could happen, political leaders insecure about what he's saying. But Donald Trump was already president once. And I would say most of those scenarios didn't really happen. Do you think it changes this time around with respect to NATO?
I think it changes. First of all, as your other question, I mean, there's already an active war, on the European continent. So that changes the stakes of everything. The first time Trump was elected, most European countries were playing a waiting game. Thought it's just going to be one term. We can wait it out, and America will, regain its senses. Well, America looks like it's possibly going to elect Donald Trump again, meaning we should have some doubts about the reliability of this U.S. protection guarantee. And second of all, now Europeans, unlike in 2016, understand war in Europe is a real possibility. Most Europeans, at least Western Europeans, didn't believe that war was really a thing that could happen in Europe. So the stakes are much higher, and I think the concern is rightfully more this time.
Do you also think that the values that NATO stands for are not necessarily represented by the U.S. anymore?
By Donald Trump, they're not represented. I mean, Trump is still not the majority of Americans. According to a poll we did last year, 68% of Americans still support a strong role of the United States in European security, and most Americans support NATO still. But those numbers are sinking among Republicans, and Donald Trump is absolutely an exception. He does not believe that the U.S. interests are well served by NATO, and he didn't in his first term either.
Nico, we've heard some Trump's critics, including his own former national security advisor, saying that Trump ultimately wants the U.S. out of NATO. Are these budgetary reasons just an excuse? Do you think if the countries paid more, the risk wouldn't be there?
We know from his last term that Donald Trump thinks about everything in transactional terms. And we are not very good in that, but maybe we have to become transactional, at least vis-a-vis Trump, if he should be president again, too. But what he says is directly against U.S. interests, and I think that should also be an issue in the U.S. It is a vital interest of the U.S. to have NATO, to have partners, to have bases, and to work together in the NATO framework. This is a missing link, and it seems to be that in the United States, it's difficult to find democratic legitimacy for foreign and security policy in the interest of the United States, but that's not exclusive to the US. We see similar development in France, but to be honest, we also see it in Germany, that it's difficult to find majorities for the right foreign and security policy. And Putin tries to play on this. And I think the messaging around Trump's campaign statement is very important. And unfortunately, it does not sound from the European side very much as a deterrent to Putin. It almost sounds like an invitation.
An invitation that, of course, would be extremely dangerous. Moritz, Russia says it's only defending itself, that it doesn't have any intention to invade, for example, a NATO country. You have been in Ukraine. You've seen what a Russian aggression means. What is your take on the intentions there?
Well, I'm sure that Putin wants to restore the territory of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine is maybe the most important part in this. Without Ukraine, his whole imperial project is not valid. At this point, I would say that the biggest danger actually exists for countries like Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, which were part of the Soviet Union. If he succeeds in Ukraine, those countries are in the biggest danger. I don't think that the first step would be NATO countries, because attacking the NATO still is a very big risk for Russia. So yeah, that's my take on this.
However, when we take a look at the U.S. perspective on this, Rachel, Nico was just telling us that this is not in the interest of the United States to, for example, pull out of NATO. But it seems like in the U.S., at least Republicans or followers of Donald Trump specifically don't seem to think that would be a big deal if the U.S. pulled out of NATO. Is the country that much more vulnerable if that happens?
I mean, there's a sort of narrow view of security and a broader view of security. If you take the narrow view of security, that really has to do with sort of territorial attacks against the United States or something like that. And this is probably the way, Trump and a lot of his voters would think about security. They're, of course, more focused on the southern border, where there are, concerns or things like terrorism. And so to make the case that sort of the war in Ukraine or Poland has a lot to do with the U.S. security, it's a more difficult case to make. I would say the majority of the sort of political leaders in the United States still have this view of allied security and understand that international alliances make the U.S. stronger. But that's a case that's slightly more difficult to make in the public than it used to be, especially among Republican voters. But we're not quite there. I mean, Trump is extreme in his views. But the parts that shared across basically the entire Republican Party and also part of the Democratic Party is this part about NATO members not paying up, which is to say this kind of resentment that the U.S. is paying too much or investing too much in European security. And that's actually been a long-standing critique, especially from Republicans, but also from Democratic presidents.
The question is, of course, what can be done now? Nico, of course, the European Union has been considering creating an independent military for a long time. It is also talking about spending more militarily. Is all that viable at the current moment, especially to create, let's say, a unified European military?
In Europe, I think one starts to wonder how many wake-up calls do we actually need. There was a movement on this front in 2014. There was the Russian full invasion into Ukraine in 2022. And now there is the projection of a new Trump presidency. Something has been done. And for example, that Germany is seriously working toward permanent posture of a battle-ready brigade in Lithuania, I think is a significant step forward. But I think it's also fair to say that even if Trump is expressing things in a totally unacceptable way, there is a hard truth at the bottom of it. And the hard truth is that we have not done what we committed ourselves to in NATO, and that we always are looking for others to solve our security problems for us. And the whole argumentation will be much easier, regardless of who will be president of the United States, if the Europeans step up in their own security matters. And that means really digging deep to help Ukraine more, and to find a new initiative on a European level to support Ukraine, especially in this critical phase, also to provide hope to Ukrainians, and at the same time making Europe more secure. The eastern flank of NATO is at the same time the eastern border of the European Union. And I think there is a lot the Europeans could do instead of just expressing concerns or writing op-eds or letters to one another.
From what you say, Nico, it all starts in Ukraine at this moment. If European NATO countries fear they might have to defend themselves alone in the future, that outlook is even more dire for Ukraine. In the US, right-wing Republicans, pushed by Trump, recently blocked an aid package that included military assistance for Ukraine. The consequences are felt on the battlefield and now even triggered a change of leadership by Volodymyr Zelensky.
Meet the new guy, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky. Once the head of the ground forces, he is now replacing former Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny, who was beloved by both the people and the army. Known for his toughness, Syrsky trained at the military academy in Moscow. Our goals remain unchanged: holding our positions, holding our territory, exhausting the enemy by inflicting maximum casualties, conducting an active defense by seizing the initiative. We already do it on a daily basis. The new army chief brings his own team with him and is relying on a new strategy, which includes expanding the use of electronic warfare and more automated weapon systems. Drones will compensate for ammunition shortages. Additionally, troops will be supplied with weapons from abroad more quickly. The new strategy also allows for a more rapid rotation of soldiers, but the new mobilization law that would make this possible is still stuck in Parliament. Do these changes present more risks or opportunities for Ukraine?
Well, it seems like with Trump's remarks, with the territorial gains of Russia in Ukraine in recent weeks, and of course with those changes in Kiev's top positions, things are really not looking good for Ukraine at the moment. How bad is it?
Well, the atmosphere is really bad. It was bad already in autumn or the beginning of winter, when it was clear that the counteroffensive basically failed. So people understood that the perspective is totally unclear, the perspective of this war. Before, people thought, okay, we have to endure a little more and then the war will end. Now, this is totally unclear. Since then, over the last weeks, it got clear that, basically from the US, nothing to expect in this year. And also among the Ukrainians, these political games in the leadership. And I would say that the sacking of Zaluzhny by Zelensky is also part of the political game. It's seen not very positive.
Nico, what do we know about that new strategy that the new commander-in-chief wants to follow, and how dependent is that from US help?
On tactics, I think that was one of the main conflicts between Zaluzhny and the president, whether to, for example, hold Avdiivka as long as possible, administer losses to the Russian side, or to leave Avdiivka and shorten the front lines, especially with limited resources when it comes to ammunition and other important resources. Now that the decision has been made, Syrsky is in charge, troops have been reinforced in Avdiivka, and to be honest with you, from a military point of view, I'm skeptical. And this might maybe administer losses to the Russian side, but also take very important power away from other segments of the front line, and maybe even future offensive power away from Ukraine. But it seems that Syrsky is better in translating the political will of the president into the battlefield and is more trusted by the Ukrainian president. It all points to a very difficult phase for Ukraine to come. And that the command is now changed is one issue, but I think Ukraine has to solve mobilization and not to pass it on as a hot potato from one to another. I think they have to take responsibility and get mobilization on track. It is necessary for Ukraine. And the other element is the justice in the mobilization. I know this is hard for everybody who was able to avoid being mobilized at the moment, But I think this is necessary also for the inner peace of Ukrainian society, so that there's no impression that there are some people fighting and others who can avoid being part of the fight. But let's be very honest here. The next months will be very difficult for Ukraine on the battlefield, especially in the east.
Coming back to the question of financing and weapons, do you think Ukraine can manage having less support from the U.S.? Because it was said for a long time that it was not possible without the U.S. Can Europe deal with that alone?
It's not so much about money. It is about money too, and the sums are very important also for the media debate about this. But in the end, it's about production capabilities. And we in Europe were not able to raise our production capabilities in time. They might kick in later. Some steps are taken now. So I think we should consider also using European Peace Facility money or other European money to buy from US companies if necessary, if the Congress is not giving the funds. What is important is that the capabilities are arriving with the Ukrainians, and especially in the gap between now and at least the presidential elections in the US, and to provide also some way forward for the Ukrainians. I think that's crucial. I think the Europeans still, when it comes to France, Italy, Spain, they have more capabilities and they should do more. But somebody has to lead the process, bring everybody together, put something on the table and say, look, that's what we are doing now. Let's make a new effort. Please, everybody join in. But I'm missing exactly that element. Maybe something will happen here at Munich Security Conference that starts tomorrow.
Leading the process is an important keyword there, Rachel. Critics of Joe Biden have said that the U.S. lacks a clear strategy on what it wants regarding Russia in general. Do you agree with that?
I think Joe Biden has a very clear strategy of what he would want. The problem, as we're seeing, is that the president's abilities are limited, right? Biden has been pushing for a long time for this funding package to support Ukraine, and he can't make the difference, right? The Republicans can stop it. So I think Biden's strategy is pretty clear, but what happens with the U.S. support is very much an open question. And I think you have battling visions, battling priorities, and up until the election, it's going to be very difficult.
What about the relation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and how does that play into the equation? Because again, this was something that was speculated a lot about in the last term of Donald Trump, and it was not like we could say that the U.S. became a strong ally of Russia or anything like it. Are these fears more justified this time around?
I don't know if they're more justified, but I think they're still justified. I mean, on two accounts. The first account is that Trump has something like a grudge against certain European countries, those who don't carry their weight in his view. And his relationship with Vladimir Putin is a bit unclear. And it's not always clear that he has a sort of long-term strategy vis-a-vis Putin. So I think there is plenty of room to be concerned on both accounts for Europe.
I wanted to ask you if the perspective in Ukraine is the same, but maybe you can jump in on that.
If I may add, as a historian, it was a dream already in the Soviet Union for the Russians to split Europe and the US. And so in this sense, for Vladimir Putin, the election of Donald Trump is a very nice present.
Although he says he doesn't want that. He just said that he wants Joe Biden. And
he says a lot of things that he doesn't
Well,
really want, or
Putin, I also
vice
don't know.
versa. Yeah.
Okay. Would you agree, Nico, that Putin is succeeding in that goal, if you will?
Well, first of all, on what Putin says, I think he is a KGB person. He never actually says what he thinks, and he never does what he says. So I would not subscribe to his idea that he supports Biden. I think the opposite is true. When it comes to signals to Putin, I think it's very important for the Europeans now to do everything necessary to signal to Putin, look, if you attack us, whatever you will do, you will lose. And if the Europeans are saying, oh, it's very difficult without the United States, and please, US, help us because we cannot do it alone, this might be a big temptation for Putin to try things. So it's very important, I think, also to get the communication around this right. And some conversations, for example, about nuclear deterrence should not be made electoral campaign considerations for the European Parliament. I think they should be discussed behind the scenes between the NATO partners, including France and the UK. I think that's also a very necessary element right now. What I like is the active exercising. I think this is a good signal to the Russian side with the exercises that are going on right now. I think we need more of that.
That's all we have time for in this discussion. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. And of course, we'll see how that plays around. We cannot predict the future, but we certainly can try to see scenarios. So thank you to all of you for that. Thank you for watching, of course. And remember that you can always watch our shows and comment on them on our YouTube channel. As always, that's DW News. I'm Javier Arguedas on behalf of the entire team. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.